Okay, page 179 in our book. And then I'm going to put the PowerPoints up here so you can see them a little bit better too. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the European Union. And I'm going to try and focus on, when we talk about the European Union, I mean, we could have a whole semester-long course on it. But I'm going to focus really on kind of the themes that we've been talking about in this class in terms of this rise of the intergovernmental organizations trend that we've seen coming out of World War I and World War II. Again, kind of like the United Nations, when we talk about the European Union, first of all, it is an intergovernmental organization. It's an IGO. So it has that same characterization when we talk about international law as the United Nations. And as an IGO, the member countries make up the intergovernmental organization. And so like the UN, you have the organization is made up of sovereign states. That's where we have similarities. There's also a structure with a governmental component to it that we'll get to in a little bit. But I also want you to we're going to look at some of the differences in how the European Union is really kind of a unique IGO when we talk about the concept of intergovernmental organization because of the scope and breadth of its essentially jurisdiction. In some ways, the European Union has gone beyond this idea of simply an organization of sovereign states like the UN that we're aware of, and has kind of taken on a new personality in a way in terms of international law and also as domestic law. And the reason why I say that, and I want you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind, is this IGO that we know as the European Union has taken on almost a quasi-state-like existence, sort of like a federal government almost. But it is not a federal government in the strict definition of the word, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So currently, the European Union is made up of 27 member states, which are represented in the blue, the dark blue here. Of course, the United Kingdom under Brexit withdrew, which really was formalized in 2020. They voted on it earlier than that, but then it came into formalization in 2020. So the UK is now withdrawn from the European Union, and of course we're still working out the details on that. But so currently we have 27 members that make up the EU in its current configuration. There are candidate members, which are in the light blue here, and working on various issues that need to be resolved before they can be entered into the EU, if ever. So these are the current 27 member states. I won't read them all off. Formerly 28 member states prior to Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Brexit, leaving the European Union. So we're now back down to 27 member states. So Brexit, with the leaving the United Kingdom, left the European Union, was voted on in 2016. And in 2017, the United Kingdom formally notified the European Union they would be withdrawing. And then finally, over the course of 3 years, the UK continued with the European Union as a withdrawal process, which ended December 31st, 2020. So back to 27 members. Okay, so this next slide talks about the various treaties that over time led to what we now know as the European Union. And similar to the idea of the United Nations coming out of World War II, similar to the idea of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which was the foundational treaty that eventually led to the World Trade Organization, the idea of the European Union started with post-World War II. Well, the idea was well before post even World War I, the idea of a united Europe. But the European Union, as we now know it today, really had its nucleus post-World War II with the beginning of redevelopment or reconstruction of Europe. One of the foundational treaties was in 1952. The European Steel and Coal Community was established. And again, the idea there was to reduce barriers to movement of steel and coal throughout the continental European countries, UK, to allow for reduced or no border controls in terms of moving those products. And the idea there being post-World War II, try to reunite and not have barriers to reconstruction by having these basic materials become a hindrance in trade. And the idea was that the countries wanted to not get into trade wars, hoarding, to allow for the distribution of coal and steel coming out of that. So the community was formed in the early 50s to allow for that redevelopment. Then in 1958, the Treaties of Rome established the European Economic Community, European Atomic Energy Community, and these, again, these are foundational treaties. The European Union, as we know it today, really is a creature of treaties over time, layer upon layer upon layer of treaties. WTO is kind of the same way, leading up to the Lisbon Treaty 2009, which really formalized the EU as we know it now. But I want you to keep that in mind as well, because one of the issues with the European Union over time has been all these different treaties that have stacked on top of each other, each treaty being representative of a certain viewpoint or idea or purpose, like steel and coal, atomic energy, and the sharing, reducing of trade barriers in that respect. So then in 1987, the European Single Market was created. This was a growth of the European Economic Community. The European Economic Community was the beginnings of this idea of reduced tariffs among trading countries, or no tariffs, reduced customs and inspections, and the ability to move goods easier among the member countries. And then that became pretty much a full-blown free trade area in 1987. And then in 1993, 99, and 2003, you had, again, additional treaties that helped form the government that we now have within the European Union, the EU government, leading up to the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, which really formalized it all now. So we have the stacking of treaties over time that has led to this IGO that really now is really a governmental entity almost in and of itself. Now, the reason I bring that up, again, treaties are the fundamental basis of modern international law. That is the idea of a sovereign country through a treaty consenting and agreeing to both limit and delegate a lot of the powers that that sovereign would otherwise have. And you know, we see that a little bit in the United Nations in terms of member states having to agree sort of ahead of time to United Nations obligations, but not to the same extent as we see in the EU. We also see it a little bit in the World Trade Organization in terms of member states agreeing to harmonize their laws, which is a limitation on sovereignty. The European Union is a whole other level. Most of the fundamental powers of a sovereign that you normally think of when you talk about a sovereign state have been, you know, in terms of making law, legislating, setting up court systems. A lot of that has been delegated to the European Union as an organization. And so member states have, and again, this is kind of like if you compare it to the United States, where each state in the United States have given up a lot of the powers that would make a sovereign to the federal government. We sort of see the same idea with the European Union. However, the sovereigns still retain their individual sovereignty as a nation, whereas in the US, the individual states are not sovereign international states under international law. So that's a fundamental difference. But that's sort of academic in a way. When you look at it, it looks a lot like a federal system. But for what I really want you guys to know is just this idea that the European Union is essentially a creature of treaties. It has developed over all these years by these treaties that have each time expanded the scope of the European Union through the various different agreements. So you can kind of see here, when we talk about these treaties in 1952 with European Steel Coal Community and the European Community, and then we have the Common Market, and then the expansion and enlargement of the European Union over time until what we have today with the 27 member states. So these are the current candidate countries which are in the process of applying to integrate into the European Union: Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Turkey. In order to be admitted into the European Union, of course, the EU has to agree, but these countries also have to meet certain benchmarks in terms of economic activity, in terms of adopting like interest rates and that sort of thing, before they can be admitted or considered to be admitted. And I'm not going to really get into that too much. I just want you to know that it is an evolving organization, both in terms of adding members, and then as we saw with Brexit, the United Kingdom leaving, or a member leaving the organization. So the way that this is from the EU website, I literally cut and pasted off their website. So this is how they describe the European Union as an IGO. It's a family of democratic European countries committed to working together for peace and prosperity. It's not a state. So the EU, as an intergovernmental organization, is not a sovereign state in and of itself. The members are still sovereign individual states. But it's more than just this kind of traditional IGO where the states that are members of the EU have given up a lot of their authority, or delegated is the term they use, delegate some of their sovereignty to the institutions that are created by the European Union. So they delegate some of their sovereignty so decisions of joint interest can be made at the European Union level. And they call that European integration under European Union rules. Okay, so this first paragraph is one I want you to know for sure. I have a test question on this, I think on the final, if I remember. The European Union is not a federation like the United States. So what that means, remember, a federal government is a government where you have, like the United States, lots of federal governments around the world, where you have states or political units that otherwise could be a sovereign, that have given up some of the powers that a sovereign would have to a federal government. The federal government then has overriding authority, supreme authority over those states. And in terms of the United States, the federal government has certain areas where it has exclusive power to legislate, to engage in enforcement of the law, that kind of thing. So that's federal law, which applies to all the states. So the European Union is not a federation. The EU as a government is not a separate sovereign, even though it kind of acts like one. So it's sort of this in-between, in terms of political science kind of discussion, between a federal government and a purely governmental organization, because the states that are members still are sovereigns, but they've given up a lot of their authority in the creation of the European Union. And in fact, the way that the EU is structured, it looks a lot like a federal government, even though it's technically not. So, next slide. Four points that I want you to know about the European Union. First of all, and we're talking about it as an IGO, The European Union is a customs union, a form of a customs union. Now remember, a customs union is where you have a group of sovereign countries that have agreed to establish the same laws for imported goods. So that includes tariffs, establishing the taxes that are paid when goods are imported into the countries that are part of the customs union. So they're all going to have the same tax rate. It also applies to customs inspection standards, engineering standards, prohibition on certain types of goods, and other types of trade barriers. So the idea of the European Union is a giant customs union where the European Union as a governing entity sets these laws within the European Union that the member states must comply with in terms of imported goods. And so if you import goods into France or Germany or any other EU member state, with some exception that are limited, but you're going to have the same rules. And the idea there is that will keep the member states from competing with each other by establishing different tax rates and different other customs and trade barriers for imported goods. So that's what we mean when we talk about a customs union. Goods coming into the EU are going to have the same rules regardless of which member state you cross the border to import those goods. So next is similar, but it's a different type of component, and that is the European Union is a form of an FTA, or a free trade area. Free trade area is an area of states that have agreed for the reduction of border crossing rules within those countries. So in terms of the European Union, most of the countries, once the goods are in one of the member state countries, they can be moved to another country without stopping at the border between them, without having to have customs inspections. So basically free movement of goods within those member states. That includes services, movement of money, movement of people around the member states. So it's basically taken down the borders within the EU that historically were there when you're moving goods or services from one state to the next. That's what we mean by a free trade area. So the same rules on the customs union side for importing goods in, and then once the goods are in the EU, or produced domestically for that matter, you can move them around without having to go through customs and pay tariffs within the member states. All right, this next term is a term supranational IGO. Supra means outside or above, large, various different meanings in that respect. In this instance, when we talk about a supranational IGO, this is a form of an intergovernmental organization that essentially takes on and has been granted or delegated the power by the member states to essentially legislate. So this is where the United Nations and the WTO differ from the EU. The European Union has the ability to create law. That applies, of course, to the European Union states. In that respect, the member states have given up or delegated the authority to write these laws like import and export rules, environmental regulations, human rights laws, policing, enforcement of the law, some of the judicial branch creating courts. And so the idea of a supranational IGO is one where many of the powers of a sovereign have been delegated over to this organization, and the organization then has the power, by consent of the member states, to engage in legislative activity. That is, to impose law on the states. And that's really the fundamental difference when we look at the European Union as an IGO from the UN or the WTO. The UN, as we know, all throughout the charter is that phrase, make recommendations, which means that the UN itself doesn't have the power to require, but only to make a recommendation in terms of the General Assembly. It's different with the European Union. They have this ability that is legislative-like, so that's a fundamental difference. So when we talk, that's what we mean by a supranational IGO. It goes above and beyond the nationality of the sovereigns. Also, it's unlike the WTO in that respect, because the World Trade Organization, 163 members, but they all must consent by unanimous agreement. So the WTO, as a member organization through that unanimous consent requirement, doesn't really have legislative power. It's up to the member states themselves to consent to it. So really, the EU, when we talk about a supranational IGO, is really unique in the world. I'm not really aware of any other IGO that has that same level of power. Now, will that be the trend going forward in the decades to come? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. We'll have to see, but that's the idea there. Now again, I also want you to remember why. What is the reason why, in theory, the EU has risen to this level of power? And it's post-World War II. Again, World War II is a driving force in so much of what we see in organizations post-World War II. That is the idea that if you integrate the markets, the economies of the member states that formerly were at war in history almost all the time, and if you integrate the economies, you integrate the movement of people, then that will reduce the possibility of further military conflict and economic conflict, because you have such integration that it makes it much more difficult for those kind of things to blow up in that regard. So again, that's the kind of the theory behind the IGO, is to avoid this whole World War I, World War II situation by integrating economies and people and movement of services, and of course the euro itself. So the final point, in terms of when we talk about the European Union as an IGO, part of the European Union also is a monetary union, of course the euro. And the euro, like the dollar, is representative of the members that are part of the European Union monetary system, the euro system, by adopting a common currency. Again, that's when we look at the United States and how and why we have a federal government. That's one of the fundamental powers of the federal government, is to create a single currency. The theory behind that is, again, so you don't have individual states having their own currency, which can lead to exchange rates between states, and it's a barrier to movement of goods and services. It's a drag on the economy, and it's just not efficient. So that's the idea behind the euro. So 4 main components of the EU as an IGO that I want you to be aware of. This is like a multiple choice type question I have. What are the 4 kind of fundamental components? Customs union, that is common law, the same law for bringing in goods. Free trade, once the goods are in, or domestically good can be moved around the area freely. Supranational IGO, meaning the organization takes on federal-like powers, including the power to legislate in certain areas. And then finally, a common currency, which is not shared by all the European Union members. It's up to them if they want to, but most of them have adopted the euro, of course. All right, next slide. Whoops. Why are my slides out of order here? We'll come to that. Huh. Okay, so when we talk about the supranational character of the European Union as an organization has created 5 primary institutions. Now there are other subsidiary institutions, but this would be somewhat equivalent to how our federal government is structured under the Constitution, some of the fundamental powers of a governing body. So first we have the creation of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is represented by all member countries, and representatives in the Parliament are elected by the people within the European Union. Depending on where you reside within the EU, you get a vote. And then you elect parliamentarian, representative, and it's dependent upon the population of the respective countries. So a larger country like Germany is going to have more representatives at Parliament than a smaller country. But these are representatives that are directly elected by the people, the residents of the European Union. So again, back to this idea of IGOs as supranational power. This is also a fundamental difference when we talk about IGOs, where you now have directly elected representatives by the people involved in the organization. Now remember, at the beginning of the term, I talked about the 3 relationships in international law: state and state, state and person, and then individuals, person and person. Historically, individuals had really no input or standing in international law. And the idea of post-World War II in international law was to give individuals more standing, more rights under international law, including human rights. Again, coming out of World War II and all the atrocities. And so the idea with the EU, again, a fundamental difference on the supranational power topic, is the idea that individuals get to elect representatives that will then have partial legislative power within the EU. So if I were to make an equivalent within the United States governmental system, the Parliament is really a lot like if the House of Representatives would be when they're elected, of course, by the people in the United States. The elections are based upon population of a given state within the U.S., so the number of representatives will depend on the population, and it changes, of course, all the time. And so that's where you get your directly elected representatives based upon population. So that's another fundamental kind of unique feature of the EU as an IGO in international law that we don't really see in most other, any other IGO I can think of. Okay, next we have the Council of the European Union, which is a member of each of the governments of the European Union itself. And then we have the European Union Commission, which is also has a member of each of the EU member states. So if I was to make sort of a comparison, the European Union Commission, I have a slide on that here somewhere. Go to the slide here. So we have the European Parliament, we have the Council of Ministers, and then we have the European Union Commission. So the Council of Ministers has very different forms depending on the topic. If I was to make an equivalency, that would be more like the Senate in the US, where you have one from each country regardless of the population, and they all have one vote. Whereas the Parliament, you're going to have different numbers of representatives based on population. Within the Council of Ministers, you'll have a minister appointed by each country. So it's a little bit more like the Senate in that respect in our system. And then we have the Commission, which also has a representative from each member state. And that's sort of like the what I would call a blend between the Senate and various committees that we find within the Senate, along with the Office of Governmental Accountability, kind of all rolled into one. So these are the three main branches that are involved in creating European Union law. You also have the European Council, which is represented by the heads of state of each member country. That's more of a broad-based policy group rather than a fundamental legislative type group. Then down below, we have the Court of Justice, European Court of Justice, which would be equivalent to the International Court of Justice at the UN level, or to make an equivalency here in the United States, it would be equivalent to the Supreme Court. They also have lower level courts like the Court of First Instance, which I'm not really going to get into that here, but they have lower level courts. The primary duty of the courts within the EU are to make sure that the member states are carrying out their obligations under European Union law and European Union rules. And if another state has a dispute where they believe another member state is not carrying out the EU requirements, they can bring a case. There are various different kinds of cases that can be heard. Court of Auditors, which would be like the Government Office of Budget and Management. Economic and Social Committee, this would be a lot like our various administrative agencies. Committee of Regions, which are committees made up of regions within the EU representing agriculture, fisheries, or other type of common components. So they have some input into how the EU operates. European Investment Bank and the European Central Bank. Central Bank establishes interest rates and loan terms. And then the European Investment Bank involves investment in infrastructure and that sort of thing. So the three primary ones I want you to know: European Parliament, directly elected, Council of Ministers, member from each country, and they have different subgroups, and then the European Commission. So the Parliament my slides are different than on this one here. How did that happen? All right, so let's talk about decision making. Okay, so decision making, that is creation of European Union law, involves the three primary departments: Commission, the Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. And the way this is done is through what is known as the co-decision or ordinary, next page over I think it is, yeah, right here, okay? The co-decision process, otherwise known as the normal legislative process. And this is the idea: the Commission, which again would be like a combination of the Senate and Senate committees, because they have different, like they have the Agriculture Committee, the Transportation Committee, the Environmental Committee, so they have various different forms. The Commission proposes legislation that should be adopted. It's then sent to the Council and the Parliament to jointly agree upon the laws that will be forwarded to them by the Commission. The Commission itself doesn't directly vote on it, but it proposes the law. And then it goes through various different iterations, kind of like we see with reconciliation, that kind of thing in the US level. So both the Council and the Parliament must agree together through the co-decision process in order to make law. So again, this is very similar to how our system works under the US Constitution, whereby both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, must agree on a bill, and then it's given to the President to either agree or veto. So there's checks and balances that are built into that. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated than I'm really simplifying things. I'm not going to really focus on all the intricacies because it goes through different readings and they have a lot of very technical rules. I just want you to know this, they call this the legislative triangle. And this is the idea where the commission, which again is made up of members from each member country, creates or initiates a proposed legislative matter, and then it's given to the two branches to, through the co-decision process, agree to create law. Now again, this is kind of, when we talk about that supranational component of the EU as an IGO, this is where we see a difference in other IGOs because of this legislative power and the direct involvement of Parliament, that is the elected branch, representatives elected by the residents. Okay. So this is called the ordinary legislative procedure. And I apologize, my slides are different than in my book. I don't know what happened. When I uploaded them, they got mixed up. So I want you to know that phrase, ordinary legislative procedure. And this is the phrase that is used to describe that three-part triangle leading up to the co-decision by both parts of the European Union Parliament and Commission. Okay, so some other roles within the Parliament. Three primary roles. First of all, it shares with the Council the power to legislate. Again, fundamentally different in terms of an IGO. Most IGOs do not have legislative power. Also, supervision of all the EU institutions, power to approve or reject nomination of commissioners. Commissioners are nominated by their respective member states, and then they have to be approved, rejected, or approved by the Parliament. So this is kind of similar to when we have the appointment of, say, a cabinet member or a federal judge has to be approved by the Senate. So you have, again, these checks and balances that are sort of built into their system. And then again, like Congress, the Parliament has authority over the European Union budget, meaning through the representative process you have involvement from the voters through their representatives over the budget. So the power to legislate, again, fundamentally different. Supervision over all institutions. So unlike the United Nations, where you've got the General Assembly, it's on page 196. So unlike the General Assembly within the United Nations, which does not have legislative power, nor do they have direct supervisory power, the Parliament in the EU does have that. The General Assembly in the UN is a recommendation body only. And then, like the UN, the Parliament would have budgetary power, as does the General Assembly in the United Nations. So there are some similarities, but there's fundamental differences. Again, they say they're not a federal form of government, and that's true in the strict term, but it really looks like one. You know, on paper, you've got direct representative legislative power, you've got judicial branch, you have enforcement agencies, so it really is kind of another way of looking at a form of federal power. So if I ask you the test question, what's the difference between a federal form of government and the European Union? The basic answer is, in the European Union, the member states retain their individual sovereignty, wherein in a federal form of government, the individual member component states give up their sovereign authority and it's transferred to the federal government. So that's the fundamental difference, at least academically speaking. Okay, Parliament is directly elected by the EU voters every 5 years. Members of the Parliament represent the people, and it's, as I've said, the main lawmaking institution. I've got a few links here on these. These are posted on our Canvas page. If you want to watch some videos, which we're not going to do in class, but if you do, I've got links to various videos on how the Parliament works, if you want more information there. Okay, Council of the European Union, main decision-making body. Like the European Parliament, Council was set up back in the founding treaties in the 50s, and it represents the member states. You have one minister from each of the European Union national governments. Council has 6 main responsibilities: pass laws jointly with the Parliament. That's the co-decision ordinary legislative procedure process. Council coordinates the broad economic policies, so that would be everything from import and export law, fisheries, etc., within the EU states. The Council enters into international agreements. So in that respect, this would be an executive branch function. So the Council, in a way, has executive-like authority in that respect. It's kind of a hybrid. So it's got both legislative-like authority, but also a little bit of executive authority if we were looking at how our system is set up under the U.S. Constitution. Because in the U.S. Constitution, the President, of course, has the ability to engage in international treaty making. At the EU level, that's done through the Council. So you've got a broader, instead of having one person do it, you've got the Council as a group engaging in that. Approving the budget, in addition with the European Parliament. To develop common foreign and security policy, that would be, again, an executive function. So that would be military, quasi-military activity, to coordinate that among the member states and the United Nations, and to coordinate cooperation between the national courts and police forces, so that, of course, the individual member states, Germany, France, etc., they still have their own court systems, and they're still responsible within their own court systems for enforcement of criminal law. And that's, however, in coordination with European Union oversight. So the Council is, again, sort of a blend between legislative and executive branch power. We don't really have an equivalency so much in the U.S. system. It would be like part Senate, part President, part administrative agency, kind of all rolled into one. Let's move on. Okay, then the Commission is an independent institution, part of the 3 branches within the EU. And it is, again, you have a member from each country. And the primary purpose of the Commission is to propose legislation to the Council and the Parliament to adopt through co-decision process. Okay, the Court of Justice has a judge from each member state. So all of the European Union member states are represented on the court. And then they have, there's a lot of detail here, which I'm not going to get that much into. There is a lower level court called the Court of First Instance. And this is where lower level cases would be brought. Citizens have the ability to file their own individual cases. If they are individually harmed, they have standing. Now, why this is important, again, the evolution of international law giving individual people more rights to file and have standing in international law if they have been individually harmed. So this would be kind of like in our federal system, a federal district court, where if I had been harmed, I could file a lawsuit to try to have a law overturned because I felt it was unconstitutional, or if I had been harmed, I could seek monetary damages under our court system at the federal level. Okay, the Court of Justice has 4 basic types of cases that it can rule upon. The first is a preliminary ruling, which would be if there was a proposed law or that needed guidance on whether or not it conflicted with European Union law. The court can issue a decision on that. Proceeding for failure to fulfill an obligation. We don't really have that. Well, we kind of do, but this is where it is alleged that a member state within the European Union is not complying with European Union law, and therefore either the EU itself or another member state can initiate an action to have the court determine if a state as part of the EU is not complying, and then the court can essentially tell them what they need to do to comply. Proceedings for annulment, that is to overturn a law that violates European Union law. So if we had a member state that had a law internally that conflicted with EU rules and regulations, that could be annulled. That would be basically, we would call that unconstitutional if it violated the US Constitution, that same kind of idea. And failure to act, which is kind of similar, failure to fulfill an obligation. So these are the 4 primary cases. In some ways they're different than what we see at the Supreme Court level. Some of these are kind of a little bit more like we see with the Court of Justice. Primarily thing I want you to know are, I think I do have a test question where here's your answer for the multiple choice question on the 4 types of cases the court can handle. Okay, let's talk about 4 freedoms. So page 183. All right, so another one of the significant and primary functions of the European Union as an IGO. And again, this was created over years and years of different treaties leading up to the Lisbon Treaty. But essentially created what are called the 4 freedoms under the EU. So freedom of movement of goods, that's the free trade area I talked about. Freedom for movement of services, insurance, telecommunications, financial services, banking, that kind of thing. Again, reducing down, just like movement of goods, allowing banks and other financial institutions and service providing companies to be located in other member states without having a lot of the regulatory problems of having different states. This is the big one. Freedom of movement of people. If you're an EU citizen, you can go from wherever you want to wherever you want with some restrictions. Basically taking down the borders once you're in the EU system and the Schengen area, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then freedom of movement of capital, that is essentially money in combination with the euro in some respects. So these are the 4 freedoms that are talked about under the European Union, which have been established through all these years of treaties, leading up to finally the Lisbon Treaty, creating a common market, a single market for all 4 of those basic components. Now, when we talk about freedom of movement of people, that brings us to, next slide, the Schengen Treaty. I want you to know this term, the word Schengen. Let me know what Schengen is. If you've ever been to Europe and you go through immigration there, you'll have 2 signs. It'll say Schengen, residents, and non-Schengen. So the Schengen Treaty is a treaty that is not the EU itself, because there are other member states, including that are not part of the European Union members. But essentially, it is a treaty which established the reduction or elimination of borders among the member states and countries that are not part of the EU but have agreed to take down their borders for movement of goods. So like Switzerland, going from France to Switzerland, I'm on a train, there's no border crossing, it just crosses over. That's because of the Schengen Treaty. So the Schengen Treaty is what established, it's called the Schengen Area. And these are countries that are part of the treaty. Many of them, of course, are part of the European Union. Some are not, like Switzerland. And so this establishes a separate treaty from the EU itself, free movement of people without border control crossings. Now, there are exceptions to that if there is an incident going on or something of that nature. But for the most part, you can move freely within the Schengen countries. So you'll hear that term, the Schengen area. Which allows no police or customs checks at borders between most EU countries, Norway, Liechtenstein, for Switzerland and Iceland. Controls are strengthened at the exterior borders, so if you're entering into the Schengen common area, like going through an airport, or coming from a non-Schengen country. It's page 185. Cooperation between the police and immigration authorities within the different EU countries, and it allows you to buy and bring back personal goods from one country to the next within the Schengen area, even though they're not part of the EU, for personal use, not for commercial, for personal use without having to pay a tariff. So that would be kind of equivalent to US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement allowing those kind of things. So here are the Schengen countries, which are part of the EU, the darker blue. And then we have the Schengen countries, which are part of the treaty, but they're not part of the European Union itself. Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and little tiny Liechtenstein right next door. So again, the idea, if I'm from Germany or France or Italy and I'm going to Switzerland, there's not going to be a border check for my entry into those countries. And same with the other countries. All right, let's talk about the euro. The fourth component of the European Union. This is on page 186. So, of course, the euro is currency, like the US dollar. 19 member states out of the 27 utilize the euro as their currency now. So they no longer have a national currency. So there's no more